You think buying the S&P 500 means owning 500 companies equally, a nice even slice of each. It doesn't work that way. As of mid-2026, the 10 biggest companies make up about 38% of the whole index, and the 50 biggest make up 60%. So when you think you're spreading your money wide, most of it quietly rides on a handful of giants. Stick with me, and you'll understand what this index actually is, how it's built, and what that famous 10% return really means for your money. None of this is financial advice. I'm just showing you how the numbers actually work, so you can make your own call. And I say that as someone who bought my first index fund in my 20s without understanding a single thing inside it. I just heard S&P 500 and assumed it was safe. It mostly was, but I had no idea what I owned. So let's fix that. The S&P 500 is not a company. You can't walk up and buy one S&P 500. It's a scoreboard. Picture the score at a basketball game, one number that tells you how the whole team is doing. The S&P 500 does that for 500 of the largest public companies in the United States. Apple, Microsoft, big banks, big retailers. One number, updated all day, summing up how they're moving together. Because these 500 companies are so enormous, they cover roughly 80% of the total value of all U.S. public companies. Their combined worth topped $61 trillion at the end of 2025. That's why people use the S&P 500 as shorthand for the stock market. It isn't the whole market, but it's such a huge chunk that when it moves, the news says stocks moved. Let me make this personal. Meet Marcus. He's 30, earns about $55,000 a year, and until recently his money just sat in a checking account earning almost nothing. He'd heard the S&P 500 mentioned on the radio 100 times and had no clue what it meant. If you've ever nodded along to that term while secretly having no idea, Marcus is you. We'll follow his money the whole way through. Now here's the part almost nobody explains properly. How the scoreboard is actually calculated. It's not one vote per company. The S&P 500 is market cap weighted. That's just a fancy way of saying bigger companies count for more. A company's market cap is its share price times the number of shares the public can buy. Big company, big influence. Small company, small influence. Picture a grocery cart. You're weighing it on a scale. A single watermelon weighs more than 20 grapes. If someone adds one more watermelon, the scale jumps. Toss in another grape, and the needle barely twitches. The S&P 500 works exactly like that scale. The watermelons are companies like Apple and Nvidia. The grapes are the smaller members near the bottom of the list. This is why one giant can swing the whole index on a single day. When a company worth $2 trillion drops 5%, it drags the number down hard, even if 200 smaller companies had a good day. The scoreboard isn't lying to you. It's just heavier on one end than most beginners realize. Hold that thought because it becomes the whole story in a few minutes. So where did this thing come from? The roots go back further than you'd guess, all the way to 1860. A man named Henry Varnum Poor published an investor's guide to the railroad industry. Back then, railroads were the hot new technology, the way tech is now. Investors wanted a way to know which companies were actually worth their money. Separately, another firm, the Standard Statistics Company, started building stock indexes. In 1923, they created their first one, tracking 233 U.S. companies, but they could only calculate it once a week. Doing the math by hand was slow. In 1926, they slimmed it down to 90 stocks, 50 industrials, 20 railroads, 20 utilities, small enough to update every single day. Then in 1941, Poor's Publishing merged with Standard Statistics to form Standard & Poor's. That's the S&P in the name. Two old companies, one selling research on railroads, the other counting stock prices, joined into the outfit that would eventually run the most-watched scoreboard on Earth. The modern index we know arrived on one specific date, March 4th, 1957. That's when it expanded to 500 companies and got the name S&P 500. And here's the detail I love. It only became possible because of a machine. A Boston company called Melpar built an electronic calculation method that let Standard & Poor's crunch the numbers fast enough to update the index continuously. Before computers, tracking 500 stocks live was simply impossible. At the very start, In 1957, the 500 was made of 425 industrial companies, 60 utilities, and 15 railroads. All of them traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and together they made up about 90% of the value of every share listed there. It was unveiled at a press luncheon in New York in February 1957 to a room of 35 financial writers. Nobody there could have guessed it would become the default measuring stick for trillions of dollars. Now, a fair question you might be thinking: who actually decides which 500 companies make the list? Because the 500 biggest sounds automatic. It isn't. Unlike some indexes, like the Russell 1000, which follows strict mechanical rules, the S&P 500 is chosen by a committee. Real people at S&P Dow Jones Indices sit down and decide which companies get added and which get dropped. That surprises a lot of beginners. They assume a computer just ranks companies by size and takes the top 500. But the committee weighs things like profitability, how easily the stock trades, and how well the mix represents the American economy. The list has shifted with the times, too. In 1957, it was stuffed with railroads and factories. Today, it's dominated by technology. The scoreboard evolves as the country's economy evolves. All right, here's the moment I promised, the thing that changes how you see your own safe index fund. You've been told the S&P 500 is diversified, broad, spread out. And in a way it is. 500 companies is a lot. But let's look at where the weight actually sits. Picture the index as that grocery cart again. Of everything in it, roughly 38% of the total weight sits in just 10 companies. The top 50 companies hold 60% of the whole thing, which means the other 450 companies, nearly all of them, split the remaining 40% between them. Read that slowly. 10 companies, 38% of your money. 50 companies, 60%. When you buy an S&P 500 fund thinking you're spreading your bet across 500 names, the truth is you're making a very large bet on a very small number of tech giants. If those handful of companies stumble together, your diversified fund stumbles with them. That's not a flaw you need to panic about. It's just a fact you need to own. Here's the line I want you to remember. You're not buying 500 companies equally. You're buying the winners loudly and the rest as a whisper. Sit with that, because it reframes everything the headlines tell you about the market. Now let's talk about the number everyone quotes, that famous 10% return. Since it launched in 1957, the S&P 500 has returned about 10% a year on average. That figure is why people call it a wealth machine. And it's real. But the word doing all the heavy lifting there is average. Here's the trap. Average does not mean steady. The index almost never returns exactly 10% in a given year. Some years it's up 25%, some years it's down 20%. The 10% is what you get when you smooth out decades of wild swings. If you expect a calm, straight line up, real life will scare you right out of your investment at the worst possible time. Let me bring it back to Marcus. He decides to invest $300 a month. That's $10 a day, roughly a lunch out. If his money grows at that long-run 10% average, after 30 years, he'd have a bit over $600,000. He only put in about $108,000 of his own cash. The rest, nearly $500,000, is growth stacking on top of growth. But watch what could rattle him along the way. In year 3, the market might drop 20%. Marcus opens his statement and sees a big red number. Every instinct screams sell. If he panics and pulls out, he locks in the loss and misses the recovery. The 10% average only shows up for people who stay in their seats through the ugly years. That's the part the headline number never tells you. So how does a regular person actually own this thing? You can't buy the index directly, but you can buy a fund that copies it. An index fund, or its cousin, the ETF, which just means exchange-traded fund, holds the same 500 stocks in the same proportions. You buy one share of the fund, and you instantly own a tiny slice of all 500, weighted exactly like the real index. This idea used to sound crazy. Back in 1976, Vanguard launched the first index fund for regular people, tracking the S&P 500. Critics mocked it. Why settle for average when you could pay an expert to beat the market? Turns out, most experts don't. And here's the quiet villain in the story. the high-fee funds that charge you every year to underperform. Picture two investors, same $10,000, same 30 years. One pays a 1% yearly fee, the other pays 0.03% in a cheap index fund. That tiny gap in fees can cost the first investor tens of thousands of dollars by the end, money that silently leaks out to the fund company. That's why cost matters so much and why the cheap option so often wins. This is exactly why Warren Buffett, arguably the greatest stock picker alive, keeps telling ordinary people to skip the stock picking entirely. He's repeatedly said a low-cost S&P 500 index fund is the best investment for most people. Think about that. The master of beating the market tells you not to try. He's not being modest. He's telling you the odds. So Marcus does the simple thing. He buys a low-cost S&P 500 index fund, sets up an automatic $300 every month, and stops fiddling with it. No stock picking, no watching cable news, just steady buying month after month through the good years and the scary ones. Before you rush off to do the same, let me give you the 3 things beginners get wrong, because the S&P 500 is powerful, not magic. First, it's only the United States, 500 American companies. That's a lot, but it's not the whole world. If you own only the S&P 500, you own 0 companies in Europe, Japan, or emerging markets. That's a choice, not a default. Second, it's concentrated exactly like we saw, heavily tilted toward a few tech giants. When people call it safe, they're leaning on those winners staying on top. History says leaders change. Third, past returns don't guarantee future ones. That 10% average comes from the past. The future could be lower, especially over any 10-year stretch. Nobody signed a contract promising you a specific number. And here's the piece almost nobody mentions: the false summit. Even if you do everything right, your own behavior is the biggest risk, not the index. The market can hand you 10% a year, and you can still lose money by panic selling in a crash or chasing whatever's hot. The math works. Most people just can't sit still long enough to let it. So let's see where Marcus lands. He started at 30, terrified, with money rotting in checking. By staying invested for 3 decades, riding out at least a couple of gut-punch downturns without selling, he turns roughly $108,000 of contributions into more than $500,000. Same salary, same modest $300 a month. The difference was simply understanding what he owned and refusing to flinch. Let's pull the whole thing together. The S&P 500 is a scoreboard, not a company. One number tracking 500 giant U.S. firms worth over $61 trillion. It's weighted by size, so a few watermelons outweigh hundreds of grapes. It returns about 10% a year on average, but never in a straight line. You own it cheaply through an index fund, and its biggest danger isn't the market, it's your own hands on the sell button. Remember that 38% number from the very start, the slice of your money sitting in just 10 companies. Here's my question for you. Knowing that now, does the S&P 500 still feel like diversified to you, or does it feel more like a giant bet on big tech? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I want to know where you land. And one last time, because it matters, none of this is financial advice. I'm just handing you the mental model so you can make your own call with your eyes open.